In the spotlight then for tonight, finally waking up to the potential of using technology to address some of the country's most vexing policy challenges, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had unveiled the Digital India plan in July. The vision was clear: to connect millions of Indians to broadband service and use technology as an important plank to overhaul governance. But are government regulations an enabler or a stumbling block to this grand vision? To discuss that, I'm delighted now to be joined by Rajya Sabha MP Rajeev Chandrasekhar. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chandrasekhar, for joining us on the big picture tonight. Before we get to the more nuanced issues surrounding Digital India, let us look at the hard facts on the ground. According to UN's Broadband Commission, India ranked 131 out of 189 countries as far as broadband connectivity was concerned. Even among developing countries, India's rank was only 80th in terms of the percentage of households connected to internet connectivity. Therefore, how prepared are we, realistically speaking, to undertake Digital India, Mr. Chandrasekhar?
I think, Rono, we are not very well prepared. This issue of internet penetration and growing the internet and making available the internet has been around in terms of debate and discussion for over 5-6 years now, and we've made very little progress on that, despite significant amounts of money being spent by the UPA government and many announcements and many claims. So therefore, Digital India, when it was announced, it represented obviously a hope that it would be a new reset in terms of strategy thinking on how to get this going. Because remember, while we have 150 odd million people who are connected to the internet, India still remains one of the largest unconnected populations in the world in terms of the internet, people not being connected to the internet. So the challenge is pretty significant, and the mistake that has been made for several years now, and in my opinion continues to be made, is the fact that it is too heavily dependent on the public sector and public financing to grow the backbone of the internet. And that is where I think there hasn't been enough done to create an ecosystem where private capital, public infrastructure can all play on a complementary set of roles and parts to proliferate the net.
How would you react to this, Mr. Chandrasekhar? Because some would say that Indians have long been rather suspicious of technology. Somehow we Indians are late entrants in the technology sphere. Therefore, Digital India as a campaign was also to build more acceptance of technology among the average Indian. From that limited perspective, has Digital India created the awareness of what potential technology holds?
No, absolutely. I think, but Ron, I think you've got one thing wrong. I think Indians are very fast embracers of technology. I have seen this when I was an entrepreneur in telecom, that public policy makers and the government were always far more skeptical about proliferation and penetration of technology than the actual citizen was. So I think there are two very dichotomous kind of situations working. India as a universe of people love technology or adapt to technology very well. They move their applications, jobs, hobbies, all of that to technology very well. The other side, which is the public policy side, the government side, the regulation side, is actually far more cynical, far less adaptive to these disruptive changes that technology brings. And unfortunately, what is holding us back is that part of this equation. It is not the lack of interest, courage, capacity on the part of the Indian consumer, but the lack of the part of the regulatory and public policy side.
So what would you then say? Has government's mentality then swayed between either ambivalence at best or outright hostility at worst? I mean, is that a correct way of looking at it?
Yeah, I actually say it differently. I think it is ignorance and pitiable ignorance on one side, and I don't mean that to be rude, but unfortunately too many sophisticated issues are not well understood by people in government. That is one part of it. And the second element, you must understand, there is a legacy of corporate play that wants to maintain the status quo. So there is almost a tacit understanding of the status quo continuing because of certain influential telcos or corporates in that space, as well as, like I said, the ignorance or lack of ability and lack of capacity within the regulatory and government policy making system.
Right, right. So then let us take each of the two things that you've mentioned there, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Ignorance or lack of sophistry in handling complex internet-related issues on one hand, and telcos' collective power in influencing policy making on the other. As far as public policy making is concerned in this field, one big thorny issue, of course, of late has been that of net neutrality. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg was in town and he made a strong pitch for it. It has been 12 months since the government decided to come up with a policy, but it's been in a limbo. What has the government's handling of this so far revealed to you, sir?
No, I think it's revealed two very, very stark facts. One is that the influence of existing telcos on the process of regulation and the process of policy making is far too high to be healthy and far too high to be good for the growth of the internet and the growth of digital India. That became obvious with the TRAI consultation paper and the way the TRAI managed the consultation. The second part, the moment public outright got that matter out of TRAI's clutches and moved it to the Department of Telecom, the second evidence, that is the government's own discussion paper on net neutrality, revealed the depth of or lack of understanding, the depth of lack of understanding, if I can use that phrase, within the government on how to regulate a sophisticated, nuanced subject like net neutrality. The repeated temptation to move away from basic fundamental principles to compromises will always cause something that is not good for anybody. And that is what the government has demonstrated. It is clearly a lack of clarity in their own public policy objectives, their policy goals, and the lack of putting the consumer at the heart of public policy making.
Because, sir, this is, of course, one subject which really has fired up many users on social media. What would you tell them, since you've taken a clear position as far as this issue is concerned? How can the users, internet users, safeguard their interests?
No, first of all, I think the activism that internet users in India have shown must remain active, because I fail to understand why the government of India has still not taken a decision, or the TRAI has not taken a view on net neutrality. From where I stand...
So therefore, sir, are you implying then that the fact that decision has not been taken is because of the telcos' grip over policy making?
I'm implying that there is no need for them to delays. I am implying and saying it as it is, that this is a very, very simple issue to regulate and make policy for. And that the fundamental requirement for Digital India to be a success is that the nature of the internet in India cannot be distorted, cannot be handed over to a few big corporate names that will choose and pick where consumers of India will go to surf the net and use what services. The internet must, in the Indian context, remain the way it is, unfettered, with no gatekeepers, with equal access to all consumers. That is absolutely core to the DNA of Digital India as I see it.
So essentially, if it is not unfettered, then it sort of defeats the very idea of Digital India, because Sam Pedroda recently said that his idea of Digital India is democratization of information.
If you tinker with net neutrality and give distortionary power to a few companies vis-a-vis the net in India, you will distort Digital India. Because you may have 900 million people with access to the internet, but you will have them in effect being remote controlled by some big brothers and gatekeepers to the internet, and thus not allowing them to use the internet to its full potential, which is what Digital India is about. It's about transforming the lives by allowing access to information and services of all kinds without any discrimination and fetter, except for those that violate national security and law.
Sir, in your Times of India article recently, you mentioned very clearly that TRAI has suffered from serious credibility problems and that it's not independent enough. And you just now also mentioned as well the influence that telcos play in policy making, that is unhealthy. Can you give us more specific examples in that regard?
No, I think, I can give you 100 examples, but I can give you the simplest example is what you and I face and hundreds of millions of consumers face every day, which is poor call quality. The concept of the whole issue of call drops. Call drops is a living, breathing example of why the regulator has failed, and has failed for not 1 month, 2 months, for a repeated number of years. Call drops is a sign that network quality, which is core to a consumer satisfaction experience, and consumers are core to any public policy making, that network quality has never been high on the agenda of the regulator in terms of enforcing standards on telcos. And when the regulator does not ask that from the telcos do what they have to do, which is minimize capital expenditure and maximize the number of customers you load on a network. So call drops is a classic example of how the regulator has moved so far away from the consumer and so close to telcos that the balance between the ability for telcos to invest and create viable business plans and consumers to have their own rights and satisfaction, that balance has been completely distorted.
That's very well said, sir. Thank you so very much for joining us on The Big Picture at 10. Well,